So now we're going to add the ability to view and edit the context details in our Contacts app. We're going to do this using the routing that we've seen in an earlier video, and we're also going to need to share the resource across the different controllers that we set up. So to begin with, let's set up a link to our edit page. The URL is going to be /contact/ the contact's name, which will be contact.name.clean. And I'll close that off on the other side of the templates. And so if I refresh, we now have a link here that takes us to /contact/Tom-Ashworth. Now to get this working, we're going to need to set up some routing. We did this in a previous video, but just in case you've forgotten, I will go through it again because this one's going to be slightly more complicated. The first thing we need to do is set up a config block. This set takes two arguments, the route provider and the location provider. This is so we can configure Angular's routing system. Then in here we set up our route. So I say route provider, and I use the .when syntax to say when we are on the contact and with a name URL, then we want to use a controller called single because we're editing a single contact, and the template we're going to use is one I've set up already called single.html. Then I'll duplicate this block again and set up our route, which will just be our listing. So I'm going to call this list. In fact, I'm going to call this table, and then my template is called table.html, and I'll show you these two in just a second. So we've got our basic routing set up. The last thing we need to do is set up the location provider. Angular has two location modes, hashbang mode and HTML5 mode. Before we used hashbang mode, where Angular put a hash in the URL and rewrote our links. In HTML5 mode, it uses the HTML5 history API to avoid using the hash in the URL. This is what we're going to do. So I'm going to say location provider.html5 mode and set that to true. To get this working, I've added a base tag to the top of the document, which just contains the / which tells Angular exactly where we want to base our URLs. So I'll just show you these templates. If I open single, you can see we have a title containing the name of the person we're editing, then a table with some fields that represent the contact's data, and then a text area containing notes about the contact, which is something I've added to the database. And finally, we have a link back to the listing page or the table. If I open the table, you can see it's exactly what we had before. We name, email, number, and we've got our link back to the user, and there is some more information. If you remember from the last routing video, we used a new directive, ngview, to show Angular exactly where we wanted the templates to be loaded in. So I'm going to add that here. I'll say div ngview and close that off. And now Angular knows where to load the template when the route matches. Finally, we need to create these controllers. I'll create the table controller first. So I'll use that same dot syntax. And name it table. And it's a function, and we need to take the scope, and again we're going to need access to a resource. I'm going to set the resource up in here again. Eventually we're going to share these across the two controllers, and again we'll need this because we're again using a list of contacts. And I'm actually going to delete this from the contacts controller and move this window.contact into our new table controller. So you can see the contacts controller is not actually doing anything. We've just moved everything to the table controller because that gets loaded in when the route is just a slash, and when we've loaded in our table template. So now I've loaded the page again and everything seems to be working. We can see our table, but if I click this, we'll get an error from Angular because we haven't set up the single controller. So I'll duplicate our table controller and rename it to single. And now we just want to get one contact. So I'll say scope.contact is get. And remember how we used the route params service to grab the name from the URL before? We're going to do that again here. I'm going to say route params, and then use that as a parameter in the URL when we grab the contact from the database. It's important to note here I'm using contact.get, not contact.query. Query is used to get an array from the server, whereas .get is used to get just a single item back from the server, where, for example, here we're getting a specific contact. So I'll say name is rootparams.name, and rootparams.name will get this from the URL. We're setting up the scope.contact model, which is what the single .html template looks at, contact.name. And so hopefully now if I refresh this page, we should have our information filled out with my info, which indeed we do. We can head back to the list and edit me again. Now we have the simple app set up with some routing. Right now we have this contact resource duplicated across both our controllers, which really isn't ideal. Ideally we'd define this once and be able to request it inside any controller. We do this by creating our own service. I'm going to use the Angular factory syntax to create this shared service. So I give it a name, contact, and then a function. And again, this function can request things from Angular, so we're just going to request the resource. And then from the function, return exactly what we've done below by returning a resource. Now we don't need to set up this contact every time, we just use Angular to request it. This is essentially creating our own a service that Angular can dependency inject. So you can see we've requested it here, Angular recognizes it from here, and we can use it down here. I'm going to remove this and do the exact same here. Contact. We can get rid of this line, and let's just check everything's still working. We have our list of contacts, and I can click on the name and see my information in detail. We haven't got Angular updating the server yet, but that's what we'll do in the next video.